Chapter 3 Magic at the Store. For the next few days, Mandy and James were really busy rehearsing the play. On Friday afternoon, they were on stage in the middle of more rehearsals. All the children were there. James brought Blackie so that they could rehearse his part. Mrs. Todd and Mrs. Black, James's and Mandy's teachers, were in charge. James was still thinking about the mysterious Mr. Spallini and his locked trunk. Jack hadn't found out what was in it, and James's imagination was running wild. "Maybe Mr. Spallini's got a body stashed away in the trunk," he said, rolling his eyes dramatically, so that his glasses slid right down his nose. "Or stacks of money from a bank robbery," said Mandy. "Shh! Here comes Mrs. Garvey," warned Jill Redfern behind them. "You've done all very well so far," said Mrs. Garvey as she came up to the stage. "But I want you to practice hard all next week as well. That big day is a week from Saturday, and I want everything perfect for then." "I'll never get Gertie ready by then," said Gary Roberts. Mrs. Garvey gave him a weary look. "It isn't Gertie you need to worry about, Gary," she said. "What you need to do is practice your part on the recorder." Everybody laughed. Gary wasn't very good at playing the recorder. "I'm getting very good at being horrible at Horace," Andrew Pearson said. He growled at little Laura Baker. "Get out of my way, or your rabbits will end up in a rabbit pie," he snarled. "Huh," said Laura. "You'll have to do better than that. Even Patch wouldn't be frightened of that, and Fluffy would probably bite you." "How are your magic tricks coming along, James?" Mrs. Garvey asked. James bit his lip. "Not very well, Mrs. Garvey," he said. "It's really hard to learn tricks from a book." "I'm sure you'll manage with practice," said Mrs. Garvey. "Mandy can help you." "We're going to get some playing cards from the store," Mandy said. "Card tricks might not be so difficult." Mrs. Garvey looked at Blackie, sitting at James's feet. "And how's Blackie doing with his part?" Blackie had to chase Horrible Horace around the stage. Then Horrible Horace had to throw the wizard's wand away, and Blackie had to retrieve it and bring it to Mandy. "He's very good at the chasing part," Mandy said. "That's true," Andrew said. "He wouldn't stop chasing me last time we practiced. And when he retrieved the wand, he brought it back to me instead of taking it to Mandy." "That's because he's trained to give this stick back to whoever throws it," said James. "Oh, I've got an idea that should solve that," said Mandy. She held up a packet of dog biscuits. "What are those for?" said Andrew. "I'm going to try rattling the dog biscuits when he retrieves the wand," she said. "I bet Blackie would rather have a biscuit than come back to you with a stick, Andrew." "That's a good idea," said Mrs. Garvey. Andrew didn't look convinced. "At least Blackie's got a part," Amy Fenton said. "Poor Minnie hasn't got a part at all." Mrs. Garvey shook her head. "It's a little difficult to think of a part for a white mouse," she said, "and I wouldn't want Duchess to scare her." Duchess, Richard Tanner's Persian cat, was huge. She would scare the life out of Minnie. "At least I can do my gymnastics," Amy said, as Mrs. Garvey went to speak to another group of pupils. "But I'm still sorry for poor Minnie." Mandy smiled at her. "Why don't you ask Mrs. Garvey if you can bring Minnie to the pet rehearsal next week? As long as you keep her in her cage, Duchess won't harm her." Amy cheered up. "That's a good idea," she said. "I'll do that. She'd like to see the play." "Now, back to work," Mrs. Todd said. "We've still got a lot to do. Let's try Blackie's part with the dog biscuits this time." Andrew took his place center stage as the villagers cowered in fear before him. James lay down at Mandy's feet. Mandy put her head lightly on Blackie's collar, keeping him close to her. Then she turned to Andrew. "Look what you've done to my master!" she cried. "You have stolen his wand! You have stolen his power!" Andrew raised the wizard's magic wand. "And now I'm going to turn all your pets to stone," he snarled. Mandy dropped to one knee and gave Blackie a little push. "Go, Blackie!" she said urgently. "Get Andrew!" Blackie trotted forward, and Andrew threw his hands in the air and began to run away from the dog. Once, twice, 3 times around the stage. Then Andrew flung the wand high in the air. Blackie looked up. He watched the stick turn and twist as it fell toward him. He made a leap and caught it. Quickly, Mandy pulled out the packet of dog biscuits and rattled them. Blackie's ears pricked up as he heard the familiar sound. He turned and looked at Mandy. "Here, boy," she whispered. Blackie ran toward her, and Mandy grabbed the wand and gave Blackie his reward. Blackie crunched the biscuit as the rest of the cast started to clap. "It worked," said Mrs. Garvey. "Great job, Mandy." Mandy smiled. "Good boy, Blackie," she said to the Labrador. By the time school was over, Mandy and James were very proud of Blackie. James clipped on the Labrador's leash as they walked through the school gates. "You were great, boy," he said, giving Blackie a pat. Mandy laughed. "I think the dog biscuits helped," she said. "One thing's for sure," James said. "Blackie is going to really like rehearsing now that he knows that he gets biscuits as a reward." "I'll just have to make sure he doesn't get too many," Mandy said, "or he'll get fat." "Let's see if Mrs. McFarlane has those playing cards I needed for my magic tricks," James said as they reached the store. "Mrs. McFarlane has everything," Mandy said as they pushed open the door and went in. The general store was their favorite shop in the village. It sold all kinds of things, comics and candy, games and books. Mandy was so busy looking at the animal magazines by the door that she didn't notice when James suddenly stopped dead. "Ouch," she said, bumping into him. "What's the matter?" "Look," James said. "It's him." Mandy looked across at the store counter. Mr. Spillini, the mysterious guest at Hobart's Corner, was buying stamps, his black cape thrown over one shoulder. Mrs. McFarlane looked over to Mandy and James and smiled. "I'll be a minute," she said. "That's all right, Mrs. McFarlane," Mandy said. "We'll just have a look around. James is looking for playing cards." "I have to learn some magic tricks," James explained with a grin. "You'll find them on the far wall, bottom shelf," Mrs. McFarlane said, and she turned back to the counter. As James walked over to search for them, Mandy saw Mr. Spillini turning to look at them. He seemed very interested in what they were doing. Then her attention was caught by a shelf of toys in the corner of the shop, and she forgot all about him. "Hey, James," she called, picking up a box from the shelf. "Look what I found." James came over, a pack of playing cards in his hand. "Magic tricks," he said, reading the label on the box. "These look terrific." The bell on the door rang as a large woman with a hat perched right on top of her head came bustling into the shop. She carried an overweight Pekingese under one arm. It was Mrs. Ponsonby, the bossiest woman in Wilford. Blackie galloped over and tried to make friends with the Pekingese, but it only yapped at him. "Good afternoon, Mandy," Mrs. Ponsonby said. Then, before Mandy could reply, she caught sight of James with a pack of cards in his hands. "Playing cards," she said. "James Hunter, I hope you're not taking to gambling." James tried to say something, but Mrs. Ponsonby paid no attention. "And what else do you have there?" she asked, peering at the box in the other hand. "Magic tricks, what a waste of money. You should be buying something educational instead of spending money on tricks." Mandy saw someone move out of the corner of her eye. She looked around. Mr. Spillini turned from the store counter, his black cape swirling around him. For a moment, he looked straight at Mandy. His eyes sparkled, and he gave her a wink. Then he swept up to Mrs. Ponsonby and bowed. "You do not like magic tricks, madame?" he asked. Mrs. Ponsonby looked startled. "I don't like surprises," she said. "Not that any trick could surprise me. I'm not easily taken in, you know." Mr. Spillini spread his hands wide. "Are you never surprised?" he said. "Not even when you find something strange behind your ear?" "Behind my ear?" Mrs. Ponsonby screeched. "What on earth are you talking about?" Mr. Spillini smiled widely and stretched out his hand. Before Mrs. Ponsonby could say another word, Mr. Spillini put his hand behind her ear and drew out an egg. "Wow," said James, his mouth dropping open. "Did you see that?" "How'd he do it?" said Mandy. "Magic," James breathed. Mrs. Ponsonby's eyes popped. "Where did you get that?" she said, staring at the egg in Mr. Spillini's hand. Mr. Spillini smiled. "From behind your ear," he said. He put his head to one side. A surprising place to keep an egg. And with another bow, he swept out of the shop, his cape billowing behind him. "Well," said Mrs. Ponsonby at last, "did you ever see anything as rude as that in your life? An egg behind my ear!" Mandy and James stood there, their mouths clamped shut, trying not to laugh. Mrs. McFarlane's eyes were as round as saucers. "Well," she said, "I must say that Mr. Spilini is a strange one. You don't see many top hats and capes in Welford, and as for taking eggs out of people's ears, I've never seen anything like it." "Humph!" said Mrs. Ponsonby. "If you ask me, there's something funny about that man. Anybody that goes around in a big black cape just has to be suspicious. I think he's a spy." "A spy?" said Mrs. McFarlane. "Why on earth would a spy come to Welford?" "On a secret mission," Mrs. Ponsonby said. Mandy and James looked at each other. "A secret mission?" Mandy whispered. "Mrs. Ponsonby must have read some pretty weird books." "If she thinks spies dress like that, she must," James replied. "Mr. Spilini isn't a spy. He's a magician."